topic here will be the World War II, from the invasion of Poland up until the Pearl Harbor attack. We have already completed the card game that looks at the German aggression. We've already addressed Japan, Germany, and Italy aggression, some of the events that have taken place. In class, you were asked to complete a chart with Japan, Italy, and Germany, and then kind of document their causes. So hopefully you've completed that particular task already. For today, we're going to be looking at what was going on in the United States from the point of government and other interest groups from Poland, the start of World War II. And so you have these four color boxes here. And what I would like you to do is simply create another chart with four issues and figure out what your solution would be. So economic interest and pressure from American business owners. What's going on here is that business owners are kind of using World War I logic. And if you remember, in World War I, money was made. There were significant profits made. And so those business owners are putting you in a position as somebody representing the federal government was going to ultimately advise Roosevelt about what to do when Europe is involved in a war. So the economic interest, the business owners are looking for some of the same. They want to be able to trade. What is your policy going to look like? The isolationists, they just want no involvement. These individuals are interesting because keep in mind all of the brutality of World War II. The isolationists, these individuals want no involvement. They simply want the United States to remain out of European and global affairs. The Jewish lobby, these are Jewish Americans that are trying to get you to develop some sort of policy to deal with victims of Nazi aggression. Fleeing Jewish refugees are looking for some sort of assistance. What is that assistance going to look like? And then the military strategists who are trying to get you to do something about the growing Japanese and German threat. So the task here is for you to just come up with a couple of strategies. What would you do if you were advising the president? What would you do to try to satisfy all of the interests of all of these four various groups? So take a minute, do that now, and then we will proceed looking at some of the information. All right, so here we go. Economic interest and pressure from American business owners. This machine here is the Hollerith machine. It's the early stages of computer technology. And I also have this source here that looks at some of the trade that was involved from the United States going to the Nazis. So here they make a connection between GM trade for General Motors, and they kind of address some more items from General Motors. Let's see, what else do we have here? ITT, making profits off of the Germans, and then so on, Chase National Bank. So Henry Ford, all of these corporations in some way are helping the Nazis directly or indirectly. So the issue here is if you are going to satisfy group number one that wants full access to trade, would you be helping the Nazis ultimately achieve their goals? So like this machine right here, there was a book called IBM and the Holocaust, looks at the leasing of this Hollerith machine, which was used to track data. So think about what the Nazis might possibly want with some sort of machine that could keep track of data. That's a question there. Task number one, now we have another issue. You have to develop a refugee plan. So we know that there are many individuals who are trying to leave, Nazi Germany, and these individuals simply want out. They want to get somewhere. Where are they going to go? We have no idea. So the issue here is you're being tasked with coming up with some sort of refugee plan. What are you going to do? Are you going to allow these refugees into the United States? Are you going to, how do you do that? Do you allow 1 million? Do you allow children? All of these questions would have to be developed, resolved. So think about that question, as you kind of proceed here. What would you do with your refugee problem? Let's move on. Here we have an example. It could be possibly the end result of your policy that you developed here. And this is the story of the St. Louis. So you have St. Louis. Uh, Passengers have fled Nazi Germany, and they are trying to, with this image here, is trying to show you their route, and they're trying to gain entrance into any country that will accept them, which is why I wanted you to develop some sort of refugee plan. The end result, these individuals are going to be sent back to occupied Europe, which is problematic because these individuals, many are going to perish. So just a quick review, these are the areas that are under Nazi control during the war. And I cannot emphasize enough that when Germany takes over the Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, Poland, and Russia, that they accumulate that area's Jewish population, Romani population, homosexuals, the malformed, people with Down syndrome, all of the people that are on the Nazi target list. So as Germany expands, they obtain, sadly, more undesirables. We've already addressed the alliance, temporary alliance between Stalin and Hitler. Let's move on to some of the other items here. Europe is at war and the U.S. has declared neutrality. So here I'm trying to get you to think similar to World War One. During World War One, we declared neutrality and we allowed trade, and that led to the sinking of the Lusitania. So now you need to develop a new strategy. Keep in mind the Lusitania was destroyed, so how are you going to go about developing some sort of policy? What are you going to do? And that is the task here. What is your neutrality policy going to look like? Are you going to allow open trade? Will you allow restricted trade? So take a minute and think about that. What did the United States do? Well, in order to understand what the United States actually does for World War II this time around, they do place restrictions. If we do not recall, Smedley Butler wrote The Peace War as a Racket, and he was very critical of the amount of trade made during World War I. So if we go back to some of the sources we looked at during World War I, we looked at this book, Elliot Asinoff, America's Loss of Innocence, where he kept track of the amount of money that was being made off of the war. And this area right here seems to be crucial, where they're looking at TNT and all types of gunpowder, and that going to the Allies. And again, if you don't recall, all of this gunpowder was going to the Allies, which prompted Germany to start using unrestricted German submarine warfare to start destroying those particular vessels. So here you have to figure out a way to avoid your ships being destroyed, and they need to come up with some sort of policy that is going to satisfy the business interests as well as allow trade. And so here we start to see some of the World War II trade program restrictions and so on. Well, here we go. We have the Nye Committee that investigated World War I profits, and through his work, looking at the question whether or not you should trade with nations fighting a war, one nation, both nations, what role then do you play? Are you directly or indirectly involved? We do know that the Neutrality Act of 1935 places an embargo on World War II fighting nations. So that right there sets up a little bit of a difference between World War I and World War II. They're putting in place an embargo, and there you see some restrictions, very different from World War I, where there seem to be no restrictions. The problem here is that Nazi aggression is starting to get worse. Now, keep in mind that Japan and Italy have already embarked in their invasions of China as well as Ethiopia. So there seems to be a revision. The Neutrality Act of 35 is passed, and by the time you get to 39, where you have Hitler invading Poland, the United States is going to be in that position of neutrality, and then they develop their policy of Lend-Lease and the cash and carry program. So at the Lend-Lease program here, this one is interesting because they are leasing weaponry. And they use the argument that this is like giving a neighbor a garden hose. So that uses the logic that if your neighbor's house is burning, you're not just going to sit back and watch that. If your neighbor comes by and says, hey man, I need to use your garden hose, you would simply give him the garden hose so hopefully you can put it out. So he's kind of using the same logic here. the Lend-Lease. They are going to lease weapons that the Allies might need to win this particular conflict. And that is different from World War One, because with World War One, it seemed to be more about payments, and we know where the payments led to with regard to reparations and needing some of those items to be paid back, which led to the economic collapse. Um, they also developed the cash and carry program right here, the cash and carry program. So we have the Lend-Lease and we have the cash and carry program. And the cash and carry program is about purchasing weapons. So if you're, again, going to purchase weapons, we need to avoid trade and sinking of the Lusitania. So what they do here is say, we'll sell you what you need, but the issue is we are not delivering it to you. No, you need to come by and pick it up. You will pay with cash and you will carry the items away. So that's the difference with the policies between World War One and World War Two. Let's see, Japan versus the United States. So Japan and the United States seem to have some tension, and it's not just about Pearl Harbor. So let's take a look at some of those items. First thing, Japan destroyed the American gunboat, the Panay, in 1937. It seems that the United States seemed to use um, economic controls and trade restrictions. Something that would work like, thinking of the word here, when you just kind of refuse trade. It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, so what the United States is here is trying to do is just simply not provide Japan with the items they need to wage war. Keep in mind, during this 1930 period, the United States definitely was involved in oil trade. And so what the United States is thinking here is, if we are going to simply not agree with Japan's aggression, we don't want to go to war with Japan because that's going to be a cost to us. But what we can do is we can just cut off trade. So if the U.S. is the leading export for this time for oil, all we have to do is cut off oil to Japan, and then we will stop its military's ability to wage war. The term I was thinking of before was sanctions. That is a perfect example, a word that could be used here. The U.S. is trying to get Japan to comply with, and ending its aggression simply by cutting Japan off economically through trade. And we'll see here how these things seem to get worse between the United States and Japan. So Japan attacks Manchuria, and when Japan attacks Manchuria, they unite with Germany in the Tripartite Pact with Italy, and that's when the United States cuts off trade with the oil. They also freeze Japanese assets in the United States. So these actions are designed to prevent Japanese aggression without war. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the United States and Japan already have a strained relationship. That relationship seems to be deteriorating. By the time we even get to the World War II officially starting, and the Polish invasion and Pearl Harbor, the United States and Japan have that relationship that's already headed south. So this one slide here, if you remember those questions where I asked you to put events in chronological order, that's kind of what I'm asking you to do here. At what point, you have to put these events in order. And if we could see here, I don't know if you could say it's quiz order. That's kind of what I'm looking at. That Japan invades Manchuria, the global organization, which is a reference to the League of Nations, does not respond. Japan destroys Panay, Manchuria, and the United States simply, starts to economically and trade-wise cut them off. So I don't want you to think that Japan um, and the United States had a great relationship, and out of nowhere, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. From the Japanese point of view, they're looking at all of these acts by the United States and probably using that as the justification for the Pearl Harbor attack. Now, keep in mind, Japan and attack on Pearl Harbor is usually associated with a preemptive strike. And a preemptive strike means that you are trying to target the enemy because you believe that in the future they're probably trying to attack you. And so it's kind of like I'm going to catch these individuals off guard here. Pearl Harbor attack. Jeanette Rankin refuses to go to war. She's in Congress and is deciding, yeah, I just do not agree with this particular conflict. Notice how I added another item here. Add Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor. So what that means is Pearl Harbor is a horrific attack on the United States. And what do you do for Japanese Americans living here? That'll be addressed more next class. So it's a question to kind of think about here. It might address some of that in a minute, though. I'm not too sure. So here you see FDR's address to Congress with the Day of Infamy speech. So let's take a look at some of the items that he's saying here. Let's see that they suddenly and deliberately attacked naval forces. The Empire of Japan is responsible. Let's see what I record that this why Japan made out attack was that this was a deliberate attack planned many days or even weeks ago. They deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements. So here he's pretty much saying a lot as far as what Japan has done. And here he gets into some of the items with the attack on Hawaiian Islands, severe damage to American naval military forces. That the Japanese government also launched an attack in these particular places, Guam, Philippine Islands. They have taken a surprise offensive extending throughout the Pacific. And now he's saying he is commander-in-chief, which means he's in control of the military, and he is starting to take all measures for defense. And so the Day of Infamy speech is used for the president to use this as justification for entering into a war with Japan, which of course then they're allied with Germany and so on. So as far as the question asking you about the treatment of the Japanese Americans, you might want to go back to the site and look at, where's this file at? Let's see. We are here, this one. This file is asking you to put in chronological order the events that happened to Japanese Americans. Keep in mind, I'm not trying to offend anybody at this, but how to tell the Japanese apart from the Chinese. When we look at this particular piece, they're using the derogatory term for the Japanese, and they're pretty much looking at the physical difference, the traits, comparing the Japanese to the Chinese. I would argue that probably most Americans are going to be ignorant and not able to, so I would probably be fearful for my life if I was Japanese, Chinese, Korean, from Indochina. I would not want to put my faith in the American ability to determine. I would argue that you're probably going to be lumped in with the Japanese, and you're probably going to be targeted for, um, some sort of violence. So that issue will be addressed a little bit more next class when we get to the domestic PowerPoint. That's it for this one, the events leading up to Pearl Harbor.